Look, just to start off by saying this is a massive piece of data, and I'm never going to cover all of it today. It's online for you to review, probe yourself. Essentially, what you see is a perspective here, essentially, on what's been happening in the world as it relates to trust. And particularly, as we've seen in the past year or two, this phenomena around fake news. So, that's the premise of where we're starting. As I say, please go ahead and look online. It's a massive data set for you to probe and develop your perspective. Mine comes from a technology perspective, simply because for as long as I can remember, I've been working in comms for technology brands. So when I looked at the data as it was presented back in January, Richard Edelman typically comes over at the beginning of January, presents the data, then goes and talks to a bunch of world leaders at Davos about what it means. When I looked at it, I saw something quite interesting emerging around what I would call eventually trust and the algorithm. But there's a lot more here to see. But essentially, for me, this is the kind of premise of where I see this whole fake news phenomena. And to kind of give you a bit of sense on the history of fake news, this is the Johannes Gutenberg Press, and I think a lot of people would very much understand that this whole idea of fake news is not actually news. It's something that's been going on for many years, and many commentators have spoken about it. One guy I pay a lot of attention to is a chap named Howard Rheingold, you might know, from Stanford University. He was very much one of the early people in going online, so one of the first people to go onto the internet. And there's an interesting book he's written on called Netforms, which I urge you to read when you get a chance. But essentially, he sees this fake news phenomenon, as I say, as a 500-year phenomena, and one that actually kind of resurges every time there's a new development or new technological development in the media space. So, what we're seeing right now, from what I can gather, what I'd see is over the past 20 years at least, or maybe longer, fake news phenomena in an online world. So what that's told us essentially is, when we looked at the question of fake news and we posed it to the audience that we have as part of the Trust Barometer, essentially across the piece, 7 out of 10 people globally, and the numbers go quite significantly in certain markets and in others, that there's a real concern about this whole weaponization of fake news. Again, not a hugely significant idea in many respects. We've all been anticipating what are the information wars, the Third World War being very much fought in that direction. So everything that we see is very much apparent in the way it's manifested. I think what's interesting is when you look at its impact, certainly from an Edelman perspective, certainly from a company, from a brand perspective, and how it has an impact on trust in society. Couple of, when you note that the Pope has actually spoken out on fake news and concerns around fake news. When you go to Berlin and then there's laws been implemented to try and address some of the challenges around it, there's a big problem emerging here. And when we looked at the Trust Barometer, this is essentially the barometer, the way it presents itself in the index. What we look at is essentially, we ask a simple question actually: how much do you trust one of the following institutions to do the right thing? The 4 institutions are NGOs, business, media, and government. Simple question, simple response, essentially. And that, over the past 18 years since we've been running the data, has been our gauge on where the levels of trust are. So when you look at the data, actually, over the past couple of years, what you've seen is actually what I'd say two sides. One side, you've got a hardening of trust. On the other side, you've got an evaporation of trust. And this year, it's even more apparent. So on the left-hand side, oh, by the way, green is bad. I don't know, this was an Edelman decision on colours, so not one that I can truly control. But what you saw last year were a number of countries that actually at that point had fallen into the distrust zone. And this year, it had increased, what looks like a minor amount, but actually when you go deeper into where it was happening in those countries, actually quite significant. So, the biggest changes that we saw were in the US and China. In the US, you saw a massive drop in trust. Actually, the biggest since we've been recording this data certainly came from the US. So from an average point score, you saw a 9% decrease, so average of business, government, media, and NGOs. Actually, an aggregate score of 37%, 37-point dip in trust. Conversely, when you go to China, you saw quite the opposite in terms of a rise in trust, 7 points on average, and 27% as a composite score. So quite an interesting phenomenon, as I say. And actually, when we looked at it, 6 of the countries where there was a huge amount of trust was hardening. In 6 of the countries where there was lower levels of trust, it was equally evaporating. So this polarization effect being born, let's say, of what we think is happening in the media environment. So it's an area we want to explore a bit further. What we found is actually we asked the question around what I've called essentially truth distortion, but what impact does the media have on people's trust levels? So overall, this idea of a loss of trust was quite apparent. So I'm not sure what the truth is anymore. You've probably seen it on some of your social media feeds, and certainly in part of some of the conversations you've read. Quite interesting to see that actually what that's led to in government is even more confusion. So I don't know which politicians to trust anymore. So a massive loss of trust in government as a result of what we're seeing in the media. And when we look at business, again, those brands that are trying so hard to regain trust or build trust with their customers, the media is not necessarily the only route to ensuring this. So quite a significant bit of distortion happening in the media space. Some of you might actually follow Marshall McLuhan, who's the Canadian media academic. A few years ago coined the term, the medium is the message. Well, you also know that he's the guy who pretty much predicted everything that we saw in the online society. And his view on that medium, the message, would suggest that actually what we're looking at is the message is massively distorted, if the medium is the message. And actually, when we look at that more deeply, this is what we call the cloverleaf, the media cloverleaf. It's an Edelman perspective. There are many perspectives on the fragmentation of the media. This is our perspective, and it simply boils down to 2 areas, and it is very oversimplification in many respects. On one side, you've got the publishers. Within that publisher set, you have, let's call it traditional journalism-led media. You've got brands who are increasingly becoming the source of information, source of media. You've got these, let's call them YouTubers and the like, these influencers that are growing up, certainly amongst these younger generations, as sources of information. And they're the ones who are creating the content, publishing the content. And then you've got the platforms, which are increasingly the route through to that content. So search media, social media, and even some of the news apps. So we asked for the first time for people to define what they meant by media and how they'd kind of weight these areas. So it's quite interesting when you look at it, actually. And we didn't do what I've been asking for, and I'm hoping to get, is some of the demographic cuts on this as well. But certainly from an overall population perspective, what you see is, a quarter of people, well, 25% of people would rate search media as part of media, 48% on social, and then 41% on news apps. So that's how people are perceiving those platforms. Quite interesting and important as we kind of move forward. Journalist media, 89%. So people think of journalist-driven media as media. I was saying to the chaps earlier on, I'm thinking about the 11% who didn't think that journalist media was media. I'm trying to think what they're about and where they came from. Influencers, increasingly important, certainly from our world in Edelman, we're looking more closely at the role of influencers as some of those media publications that, you see a shift certainly there in terms of the readership numbers going down, the advertising bucks going down, kind of a bit of consolidation in that space as well, so where media is going. And then certainly, as I say, brands becoming, the media companies in themselves, so being able to put out content that's seen in a credible way. This phenomena that we talk a lot about in terms of content marketing, certainly guiding the way in that. So it's quite interesting when you think about this fragmentation of media, how we start to perceive where fake news emerges, what's the truth, what are the challenges there. I think when we then took those platforms and those publishers and started tracking them over time, some saw and some analyzed, looked at this data. I looked at it slightly differently, as I say, because that's me. But they saw a rebound in trust in journalist media. What I saw is actually a correction in many respects. Reason being, so the way to look at it is the black line is essentially the traditional media. So what would be online media, what would be newspapers, what would be TV. And what you can see there is a bit of jagged kind of progress over the past couple of years, and a big spike in the past year alone. And then the platforms, which we grouped as essentially social media and search. What's interesting there is actually social media historically, if we just broke that out separately, it was very much in the distrust zone. It was definitely below 50%, which is what we call distrusted. So I think a healthy distrust in what we're seeing on social media. Search media actually, last year, it overtook traditional media as a credible source, as a trusted source. So people actually said that AI-driven editors were more trusted than human editors. That, thankfully, changed this past year. People started to wake up, and that first thing that you see on your Google or your Bing or whatever search engine you use is not necessarily the picture of truth. But when we went a bit deeper into the individuals, so when we look at kind of who the credible people are, or where authority and credibility came from, journalists, when we look at the set, were pretty low down historically, and they were in the kind of distrusted set. What we saw this past year globally was a spike, quite a significant spike of 12 points of trust in journalists as credible sources of information. And I think that's what's driven that kind of correction. And I call it a correction because I think, as I say, for me, journalist media is definitely the media that we should be looking to in terms of a credible source of information. But significantly, I'd say, given the events over the past couple of years, people are turning to those sources even more so, which is great. And I might, my panelists might have a different view on it as we talk later. And then the other side was peers, so people like you. And people like you had very high levels of trust over the past few years, and we were tracking it. So, which kind of makes sense, right? My mate Dave is pretty good, trusted source of information, but gladly he's not my only source of newsworthy and the truth. We started to see stuff that's coming from those peers as being less credible. So, as I say, when I look at it on balance, I actually see a correction rather than a rebound. I see we're seeing healthy levels of skepticism across the piece. And actually, when we're looking at sources of credible and trustworthy information, we're probing that a bit deeper. Not entirely the case, but I certainly see that heading in that direction. And I think when we think about where that's coming from, what's quite interesting is that we've got two sources of data here really around news. And as I say, if it's fake news, where is news coming from? What we saw is that a huge amount of, and again, I'd say a huge amount, perhaps a healthy bit of skepticism about where news is coming from. So they think that the news agenda, or the truth agenda, is very much driven by eyeballs. So long as we get the biggest hit, we're doing the right thing. And for that reason, people have a level of distrust in what's going on from the media side of things. When it comes to breaking news, and I think some of us might have experienced it, there's perhaps that urgency to break news, not necessarily check the source, check that there's multiple different sources that allow us to build that credibility. So some level of distrust in that. And finally, that it's perhaps too ideologically driven, so too much driven by some sort of political view, which then creates, as I say, some level of distortion in what we see, which I think is quite interesting. And then actually, when we look at the kind of trusted, those news media as trusted sources, I think people aren't able to clearly discern what is good journalism versus what is bad journalism. And I think that's something for us all to take on board, and certainly from a comms PR perspective, and we're thinking about those that we engage with on behalf of our clients, whether they're doing the right thing. And I think that's applicable. And actually, the data showed these trends were very much similar in, let's say, journalism-driven media alongside social or search-driven media. So pretty much consistent that we feel that perhaps there's too much attention to eyeballs, that there's not enough source checking or fact checking, and that perhaps there's too much ideological driven information out there. So I think that truth agenda very much in question. So what does that mean? So, I was asked the question about how long we've been tracking this earlier on and what it's revealed. This is 18 years of the headlines that we've seen in trust. This battle for truth is something that emerged as a result of what we saw in this past year, this disconnect between what was happening around social media, this disconnect that was happening around traditional media. And actually what's quite interesting is our launch event, we had Kevin McKenzie, who's the deputy editor of the Daily Mirror. Interesting panel, interesting conversation. You can imagine how it is for certain, as I say, traditional media outlets where advertising numbers are being challenged. Getting eyeballs themselves is a bit of a challenge. And who do we blame? We kind of look at social media and see what's going on there. We see the revenues going up. We see some of the challenges around the information that's being spread there. So, a healthy degree of frustration what was happening on social media. But when he was asked what he thought was responsible for this rise in kind of the standards around journalism, his response was, well, the minute we put something out there, you've got a bunch of people on social media correcting it. So I think that kind of really talked to this challenge that we have around the battle for truth. But actually, coming at it from a technology perspective, when I think of 18 years of trust, I also think of 18 years of algorithms that have been getting smarter, serving up the things that we want, serving us information in a much more kind of refined, better way. They've been getting better, but actually our distrust has been increasing. So perhaps there's something within that context, something in the context of the way in which algorithms are serving a society and algorithms are driving trust or fake news, and something that we need to look more closely at and address. So when I was thinking through this a bit further, I think, well, what kind of algorithm would we need? One of the areas that we look at from a trust perspective is the attributes that kind of contribute towards trust. What are the things that people see building trust? Now, these 16 trust attributes we've kind of grouped into 5 areas around integrity, engagement, products and services, purpose and operations. I'll leave you to kind of explore that a bit more deeply. But I thought actually if we started thinking about programming algorithms with these trust attributes in mind, what kind of algorithm would you get? Personally speaking, I think there's a lot to be gained from that. Listening to another panelist at our launch event from Google, certainly they are looking much more closely at what they can be doing to refine the algorithm towards trustworthiness over newsworthiness. So the content that we're getting is not just about eyeballs, but certainly about credible sources. And more broadly, what I was thinking is actually when you start thinking through those attributes, the fact that people value the idea of admirable leadership, what would the world look like when we started having admirable algorithms? So really, in this whole context of fake news, I think there's this dual purpose around traditional media, around new media, and around some of the platforms. And I think as communicators, as brands, as companies, we need to start thinking a lot more about how the things that we communicate, the purpose that we inject into our messages resonates across the algorithm, how it supports algorithms as well as detracts from them. And yeah, as I say, a very quick snapshot from my perspective on what we see as this fake news phenomenon. So that's pretty much me. Happy to take any questions you have.
Firstly,
oh.
Thank you. Wonderful. Will it be available online?
100%. This might not be available. This is my view on it, but I'm happy to share the deck afterwards with folks who are there. Yeah, the whole Trust Barometer itself, there's realms and realms of data. You can go deeper into some of the geopolitical issues that we uncovered, some of the very pronounced issues that we saw in the US around what was happened around the election. So there's some rich data in there as well.
Thank you.
No worries. Hey. Yeah.
Very polite. Interesting what you were saying about trustworthiness versus newsworthiness.
Yeah.
And whether outlets will actually do that, media outlets, because obviously media is so driven by money. So I wonder what you're hearing from media outlets about how much integrity they will really be willing to bring when bottom line and shareholders ultimately are going to want to see money coming in.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think the conversation around business models was certainly quite strong in our launch panel there. Right now there's a lot of kind of tinkering around subscription-based, paywall-based, and an eyeball-based media. And I think we're in this phase of trying to understand what resonates most. And it's interesting that I heard around where the Guardian has gone with its perspective, around membership-driven subscription, so that people participate in the publication, participate in what the publication puts out, rather than kind of being told from the top what to do. There's an interesting conversation, I don't know if you follow Jeremy Hyman's, who's the author of New Power, examining how participation is increasingly the way to direct some of that emphasis. So I'm not sure if that entirely answers your question, but I think we're in this period of experimentation. And as I say, if I think about it, if I use the analogy from Howard Rheingold, where 100 years of fake news that preceded the Gutenberg press, or so and it took journalism, it took libraries, it took these new ways of thinking, approaching that information for us to get some sense of what is true. We're 20 years after Gutenberg really right now, 20 or 30 years after Gutenberg. We're still learning what to do, and I think that's critically what's happening. And so long as media are looking at that closely, you'll start to see some traction there. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. You invited us to discover our own perspective from this, and you mentioned a couple of things, but I just wondered which sort of blogs and news sites and websites you regularly check out to keep on track, and anything you can recommend to us.
Good question. Across the piece, actually, so I'm definitely get my news first thing in the morning from Search. So, and it's a bit of, it's like the distance between me and news is the minute I wake up in the morning and press the news feed. So from there, the wide varieties of sources that I've kind of selected, and some that are kind of served up to me from from BBC News to Guardian. I also kind of look at some of the more subversive type media out there. So The Intercept is, I don't know if you can follow The Intercept, one of those publications that become mainstay for me. You've got some of those firewall, as I say, subscription, paywall-based media. So Foreign Affairs is a part of my set. It's really broad, to be honest. I can't really pin down one or the other. And as much as I do, I try and encourage my team to think about that as well. Interesting exercise I did the other day, actually. We had because I'm kind of responsible for the money. I'm always looking at the bottom line, and I was looking at we get delivered about 10, 15 newspapers every morning, right? So that's the cost of 10, 15 newspapers. And sometimes I'd see this bundle of papers that haven't been touched for a week. So what's going on? So I decided to cancel the subscription. No one has said a thing. Yeah, which is quite interesting because they're going online. Certainly in Edelman, 70% of our workforce is millennial, or that sub 30 bracket. They're not necessarily picking up print media to find that information. They're looking online and getting it hours before the newspaper's been delivered. So that was an interesting experiment, but I think that will shape over time. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah.
So you say that journalists are now more trusted, but obviously some are trusted more than others.
Yeah.
Have you looked at the trust levels for different media sources and different publications as to which are more trusted than others? And
within the trust data, no, but we have a partnership with Reuters Institute, which looked I don't have the data at hand, but I can certainly point in the direction of it, and it did find where people are placing more trust when it comes to media. Interesting to have the conversation with a colleague of mine who was a former FT editor as well. And what he was finding is actually that the levels of trust, people will read some of the red tops, for example, but they have little, if any, trust in them. So they're taking the source of information for them, but not necessarily trusting it, which is quite interesting. And his view is obviously it's more about entertainment than it is about news or factual information. But I can certainly point towards that, the Reuters Institute report, because that's got quite a bit of depth in that.
Hi, very interesting, Sat, thank you.
No worries.
Can you just tell me where higher education and British universities fit into your framework? Because I'm not sure whether you lump them in with business, but it seems to me that the role of a university should be to speak truth to power. And yet the fact is that in Britain, that stopped long ago.
It's a great question. And it doesn't feature from that side. And I think, it's certainly something that it's good to hear it for the first time, actually, to take back to those who are looking at it. And I do see, I take the trust data, I do take it to various universities as well and present it to students and folks who are attending there. And The great thing about this data is, as I say, until it's exposed to someone, you don't really know what it means and the type of conversation that it drives there. And certainly amongst the university's academic folks that I speak to, it has some level of resonance. It certainly does inform them, and it is, which blew me away when my old university invited me to a lecture because they ran a course on the Trust Barometer. So we never heard anything about it until that minute. Which was interesting in itself. But yeah, I think you're right. I think there's certainly some level of insight that we can glean looking at how academia is certainly positioned here. What's interesting is, just an anecdote here, but where we have the audience for this data set, it started off very much early on at kind of opinion formers, or what we called informed public. And they would be of certain kind of economic status, certain education status, and after about 5 years, we decided actually that wasn't enough to kind of discover what's going on in terms of trust, and so we engaged a wider set. This year, one of the definitions that we had around what would be informed public was how well informed they were, and actually what we saw is a disengagement in news media. So what we had was actually a bit of a skew because we didn't have an informed public anymore, which is quite interesting in itself. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed. And I think, to your point on the academic side, I think there's something more that those commentators can certainly say about it. And we do see it, right? I mean, I do see the odd letter in The Guardian, funny enough, and good letters they are.